The next topic we are going to talk about is entity clustering. Sometimes ER diagram can get pretty complicated. When you have lots of entities, when you have lots of relationships and lots of attributes, the ER diagram can be pretty complicated and very difficult to read. The solution to that is to group entities and relationships into entity clusters so that you can read the ER diagram easily. Entity clusters are a set of one or more entity types and associated relationships grouped into a single abstract entity type. Let's take a look at an example here. This is an example of the Pine Valley Furniture ER diagram. As you can see, there are lots of entity types here, and there are lots of supertype and subtype situations here. For example, under customer, there are two types of customers, regular customer and the national customer. Under employee, there are management employee and union employee, and so on. So as you can see, the ER diagram looks pretty complicated. In order to simplify the ER diagram, what you can do is you can cluster some related entity types and the relationships together. Well, this is a much simpler ER diagram after entity clustering. How do we cluster entities? Well, there are a number of ways to do that. First, you can abstract a supertype and its subtypes into one cluster. For example, in customers here, we have customer and regular customer and national customers. In the entity cluster, we will only have one entity here called customer, which includes both the supertype and the subtype. Another way to cluster entities is to combine directly related entity types and the relationships together. For example, for employees and work centers and skills, these are all related entities and the relationships. And all of them together becomes the manufacturing part of this organization. You can cluster these entities together and create a new entity cluster called manufacturing. Another way to cluster entities is to combine strong entity types with weak entity types. So we don't have an example here. You can have a strong entity called employee and a weak entity called dependent. If you want to cluster entities, you can put these two together into one entity cluster. So those are the three techniques you can use to create entity clusters. When you create entity clusters, of course, you also need to provide supplementary ER diagrams to show the details of each entity cluster. So for example, for the manufacturing entity cluster, you will also provide a supplementary ER diagram that looks like this to show the details of the entity cluster. You create these entity clusters so that you can explain it better to the business people. They don't have to look at 200 different entities. They only need to look at maybe 10 different entity clusters. So it makes it easier for business people to understand the database. The other topic we want to talk about here is a universal data model. This is an example of a universal data model you can purchase from a data modeling company. Sometimes a company may decide to purchase the data model instead of creating their own data models. And the reason for that is because you may want to save some costs and may want to save some time in developing your data model, because data modeling is a very time-consuming and somewhat difficult task for companies. You may want to think about purchasing a data model from a data modeling company. And these data models are usually pretty high quality, and they have been tested in many different business contexts. They are pretty reliable, and they are usually designed in a way that's very flexible, so you can customize them for different business situations. So that's one option. If you don't want to do data modeling yourself, you can always purchase the data model. You can purchase these universal data models, or you can purchase something called industry-specific data models that's designed for a particular industry. So if you are in the manufacturing industry, you may want to purchase a data model that's specially developed for the manufacturing industry. Let's talk about business rules. Business rules are statements that define or constrain some aspects of the business. And there are three different types of business rules. The first one is called a derivation. It's referring to rules derived from other knowledge often in the form of a formula using attribute values. So for example, how to calculate GPA, the formula for calculating GPA, that's an example of derivation. The second type of business rule is called structural assertion, rule expressing static structure including attributes, relationships, and the definitions. Attributes, relationships, entities, data definitions, these are all examples of structural assertion. Then the third type of business rule is called action assertion. And these are rules expressing constraints or control of organizational actions. And this is the type of business rule that we are most interested in here, because this is going to trigger certain actions. For example, the purchasing order needs to be authorized by the supervisor, or if the student has finished 126 credit hours, then the student can graduate. Those are examples of action assertion. So how do you represent these action assertions in ER diagrams? In order to represent action assertions in ER diagrams, you need to identify three things. The first thing is the anchor object. That's the object on which the action is limited. You also need to identify the action. If the action is a creation of a new object, or if it's a deletion of an instance, or if it's an update of a record, or something else. And then the third thing you need to identify is the corresponding object. That's an object that's influencing the ability to perform an action on another business rule. Let's take a look at an example here. Well, we have an ER diagram here. This ER diagram describes the situation in the university. The faculty is qualified to teach a course, and the faculty is assigned to teach a course during a certain semester, and then the student register for the course during a certain semester. Let's say we have a number of business rules that we want to model here. The first business rule is for a faculty member to be assigned to teach a section of a course, the faculty member must be qualified to teach the course for which that section is scheduled. Basically here, the anchor object is assignment, because anchor object is the object on which action is limited. And the corresponding object would be the qualified and also scheduled, because corresponding objects are objects that are influencing the ability to perform an action. So if the professor is qualified to teach a course and the course is scheduled, then we can assign the faculty member to teach the course. So in this case, we draw an arrow from the anchor object and put the letter R inside this arrow, which means restriction. And then we also connect this arrow with qualified and scheduled, which are corresponding objects, because these corresponding objects are limiting the action that can be performed on the anchor object. And then let's look at another example here. In this example, we want to model this business rule. For a faculty member to be assigned to teach a section of the course, the faculty member must not be assigned to teach a total of more than 3 course sections. So in this case, the anchor object is assignment, because this is the object where the action is limited. And what's the corresponding object? Well, in this case, it's also assignment, because if the professor is assigned to teach more than 3 courses, then you cannot assign more courses to the professor. So the assignment is both the anchor object and the corresponding object. Draw an arrow out of the anchor object assignment, and it eventually returns to the assignment, which is the corresponding object. And in the arrow, you put LIM, which stands for limit. And also here you have the letter U here, means it's an upper limit, and you put the number 3 here. So it means the upper limit for assignment is 3. You cannot have more than 3 assignments for the same faculty member. So that's how you model this business rule in the ER diagram. For more complex business rules, you may not be able to use these symbols to express them clearly. Well, what you will do is you will just write these business rules as footnotes to the ER diagram.